Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We are a quiet archive for the stories that reveal the intricate and often unsettling machinery of human nature. Of all the methods of murder, poisoning is perhaps the most insidious. It is a crime of profound betrayal, often disguised as an act of care. It hides in the teacup offered by a friend, the medicine given to a loved one, the shared meal that ends a life. It requires no physical strength, only cunning and a chilling patience. It is the weapon of the silent killer, who watches from a distance as their work unfolds. Tonight, we uncap the vial and examine history's most cunning poisonings. Case 1. The case of Graham Young, the teacup poisoner. Our first story begins not in the shadows of a dark alley, but in the bright, sterile world of a school chemistry lab. It is the story of a boy genius whose brilliance was inextricably bound to a deep and terrifying malevolence. This is the case of Graham Young, a name that would become synonymous with the quiet horror of the poisoned cup of tea. Born in 1947 in Neasden, a suburb of North London, Graham Young was a peculiar child from the start. He was intellectually gifted, devouring books with a voracious appetite, but he was socially isolated, a solitary boy lost in his own strange world. While other children were interested in sports or pop music, Graham's fascinations were dark and esoteric. He was obsessed with Adolf Hitler not for his politics but for his use of cyanide. He dabbled in occultism and black magic. But his one true, all-consuming passion was toxicology, the study of poisons. By his early teens, he had amassed a formidable knowledge. He could speak with authority on the properties of antimony, arsenic, digitalis, and his personal favorite, thallium, a heavy metal known to poisoners as the poisoner's poison. It was perfect, colorless, odorless, and tasteless, its symptoms mimicking a host of natural illnesses, making it fiendishly difficult to detect. He didn't just read about poisons, he idolized the great poisoners of history, like Dr. Harvey Crippen. He saw them not as criminals, but as master craftsmen. He began to conduct his own experiments, first on mice he caught, and then, with a chilling lack of empathy, he turned his domestic laboratory on his own family. The Young household, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, became a place of mysterious, debilitating illness. His father, Fred Young, began to suffer from excruciating stomach cramps, vomiting, and bouts of diarrhea that would leave him weak for days. Graham's older sister, Winifred, experienced similar agonizing symptoms. They would come and go without explanation. Doctors were baffled. They diagnosed food poisoning, stomach bugs, mysterious viruses. No one suspected that the quiet, studious boy of the house was meticulously dosing their food and drink, observing their reactions with the detached curiosity of a research scientist. His primary subject, however, was his stepmother, Molly Young. Graham harbored a deep resentment for her, and she became the focus of his most dedicated efforts. He began to systematically poison her with small, cumulative doses of antimony and later thallium. Her decline was slow and agonizing. She suffered from violent stomach pains, constant vomiting, and eventually, a creeping paralysis that started in her legs and worked its way up her body. She lost her hair. She withered away before her family's eyes, her body a living testament to her stepson's secret work. Graham played the part of the concerned son beautifully. He would fetch her drinks, bring her meals, all the while carefully measuring out the toxic substances he had acquired from a local chemist using a false name and claiming he needed them for school experiments. He kept a detailed diary, not of a teenager's life, but of a killer's progress. He logged the doses, the times they were administered, and the effects they had, as if he were a medical researcher charting the course of a disease. In the spring of 1962, Molly Young died in a hospital bed, her body racked with pain. The official cause of death was listed as a prolapse of the spine. The doctors had missed the poisoning completely. At the age of just 14, Graham Young had committed what he considered to be the perfect murder. But his hubris grew. He began to boast to his school friends about his extensive knowledge of poisons. He started poisoning a schoolmate, Christopher Williams, making him violently ill. The boy's persistent, unexplained sickness eventually raised an alarm. It was Graham's science teacher who finally connected the dots. He noticed Graham's obsessive interest in toxicology and became suspicious. He searched Graham's school desk and found files of poison and detailed notes on their effects. The police were called. During the interrogation, the 14-year-old boy stunned the seasoned detectives. He was not remorseful or frightened. He was arrogant, proud of his knowledge. He calmly confessed to the attempted murders of his father, his sister, and his school friend. When asked about his stepmother, he coolly denied any involvement, knowing the official cause of death was on his side. He knew more about the poisons than the police questioning him. It became clear they were not dealing with a simple juvenile delinquent. They were in the presence of a profoundly disturbed and dangerous mind. Because of his age, he was not sent to prison. Instead, in 1962, he was committed to Broadmoor Hospital, Britain's most famous high-security institution for the criminally insane. He was diagnosed as a psychopath, suffering from a severe personality disorder. He was the youngest inmate Broadmoor had seen in over a century. For Graham, Broadmoor was not a prison. It was a university. He had access to the hospital's extensive medical library, and he used his time to deepen his knowledge of toxicology and pharmacology. He became a model patient, charming the psychiatrists and staff with his intelligence and apparent willingness to reform. But his experiments never stopped. He began to synthesize poisons, including cyanide, from materials he found in the hospital, even reportedly extracting toxins from the leaves of laurel bushes in the hospital grounds. He continued to poison those around him. A fellow inmate, John Barrage, died suddenly in 1S963. Young was the prime suspect, and cyanide was found in the man's system, but the death was officially ruled a suicide. Other inmates and staff members fell ill with the same mysterious stomach complaints that had plagued his family, but no one made the connection. They saw Graham as a success story, a testament to the power of psychiatric rehabilitation. In 1970, after 9 years, the head psychiatrist at Broadmoor made a fateful decision. He declared Graham Young cured and no longer a danger to society. He was ready to be released. A probation officer warned against this, stating bluntly, "This man is a dangerous psychopath. He will kill again." The warning was ignored. In February 1971, Graham Young, now 23 years old, walked out of Broadmoor a free man. He went to live in a hostel and soon found a job. In a twist of dark, cosmic irony, he was hired as a storeroom assistant at John Hadland Laboratories in Bovingdon, Hertfordshire. It was a company that manufactured photographic instruments, a process that required the use of several highly toxic heavy metals, including thallium. The fox was not just in the henhouse. He had been given the keys to the entire farm. And so the cycle began anew. Young quickly ingratiated himself with his new colleagues. He was quiet, intelligent, and polite, and he was always willing to make the tea. He became the unofficial office tea boy, a role he embraced with sinister enthusiasm. He would walk around the office and the storeroom, a tray in his hands, offering cups of coffee and tea to his unsuspecting coworkers. Soon, a mysterious illness began to sweep through the Hadland Laboratories. It became known as the Bovingdon bug. The first to fall seriously ill was the firm's 59-year-old foreman, Bob Eggle. He suffered from debilitating cramps, vomiting, and a strange, creeping numbness in his limbs. He was admitted to the hospital, where his condition worsened. His hair fell out. He became paralyzed. Doctors were at a loss. In July 1971, after weeks of agony, Bob Eggle died. His death was officially attributed to a rare form of polyneuritis. Graham Young watched it all with a clinical, detached interest. He would morbidly quiz his colleagues about their symptoms, feigning concern while secretly documenting their decline in his diary. He was no longer just poisoning. He was conducting a comparative study. He would give one person antimony, another thallium, sometimes a cocktail of both, just to observe the different reactions. He poisoned at least half a dozen of his co-workers. Men like Fred Biggs and Jethro, but suffered terribly. They were constantly sick, their bodies wasting away, their lives becoming a cycle of pain and hospital visits. The atmosphere in the factory was one of fear and confusion. Was there a chemical leak? Was the water contaminated? Management brought in health and safety inspectors, but they could find nothing wrong with the workplace environment. The tipping point came with the death of 60-year-old Fred Biggs in November 1971. Biggs had been suffering for months. He had been one of Graham's regular customers for tea. His death, so soon after Bob Eggle's and with such similar bizarre symptoms, finally raised a red flag that could not be ignored. The company's medical officer, Dr. Ian Anderson, became deeply suspicious. The pattern of illness was too specific, too strange to be a coincidence. He began to research the symptoms: the vomiting, the hair loss, the paralysis. He realized they were classic signs of heavy metal poisoning, specifically thallium poisoning. He contacted Scotland Yard. When the police arrived at Hadland Laboratories, they began to interview the employees. They asked a simple question. Was there anyone at the firm who seemed unusual? Anyone who might have a reason to harm the others? The focus quickly fell on the quiet, bookish young man in the storeroom, Graham Young. His colleagues noted his strange, almost ghoulish fascination with their illnesses. One remembered that Graham had been surprised that Fred Biggs had taken so long to die. The police did a background check. When the name Graham Young was run through the system, the file from his time at Broadmoor appeared. The detectives knew they had their man. They went to his home to arrest him. In his room, they found what they were looking for. There were files of poison meticulously labeled. There were books on toxicology. And most damning of all, there was his diary. The diary was the ultimate confession. It was a cold, chillingly precise logbook of murder. In neat handwriting, he had chronicled every dose he had administered. He noted the amounts, the reactions, the duration of the suffering. He referred to his victims not by name, but as scientific subjects. He wrote about Fred Biggs. F is now a dead man. It is a question of time. He expressed not remorse, but frustration at his own sloppiness for allowing the pattern of poisoning to be detected. In his interrogation, his arrogance was on full display. When a detective asked him, "Do you know what thallium is?" Graham scoffed. "Of course I do," he replied. "I am an expert on thallium." He admitted to everything, his confession filled with a chilling pride in his work. He was only disappointed that his experiments had been cut short. In June 1972, Graham Young stood trial at St. Albans Crown Court. The press dubbed him the teacup poisoner. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His own diary was his death sentence. He was found guilty of the murders of Bob Eggle and Fred Biggs, the attempted murder of several others, and was sentenced to life in prison. This time, there would be no cure. He was sent to Parkhurst Prison, a high-security facility. There, his legend only grew. He befriended the Moor's murderer, Ian Brady, bonding over their shared fascination with Nazi Germany. He continued to study chemistry and toxicology. Graham Young died in his prison cell in August 1990, at the age of 42. The official cause was a heart attack, but a persistent rumor, one that seems a fitting final chapter to his story, is that he had finally administered the perfect dose, this time to himself. The case of Graham Young is a chilling study in the nature of pure intellectual evil. His violence was not born of rage, jealousy, or greed. It was the product of a monstrous God complex, a desire to wield the ultimate power, the power of life and death, not for any reason, but simply to watch what would happen. His victims were not people, they were specimens. His workplace was not a community, it was a laboratory. And the humble cup of tea, a symbol of British comfort and civility, was transformed in his hands into a vessel of slow, agonizing death. Case 2. The Chicago Tylenol Murders. The evil of Graham Young was personal, intimate, and born of a singular, twisted mind. He chose his victims. He curated their suffering. But our next case presents a different, and in some ways more terrifying form of poisoner, the Phantom. A killer with no face, no discernible motive, and whose victims were chosen not by malice, but by the cold, impartial hand of random chance. This is the story of a crime that did not just take lives. It held an entire nation hostage and forever changed the way we trust the world around us. The story begins on the morning of Wednesday, September 29, 1982, in the quiet Chicago suburb of Elk Grove Village. The day dawned like any other. In the Kellerman household, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up with a sore throat and a runny nose, the common symptoms of a simple cold. Her parents, doing what millions of parents across America would do, gave her one extra-strength Tylenol capsule. It was a brand synonymous with safety, a trusted household staple for aches, pains, and fevers. Mary took the capsule, went into the bathroom, and a few moments later, her parents heard a thud. They found their daughter collapsed on the floor, her breathing shallow, her pupils fixed and dilated. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Mary Kellerman was dead. At the hospital, her death was a tragic but seemingly explainable event. The initial diagnosis was a stroke, a massive and unexpected cerebral event. Her family was left to grieve a loss that was as sudden as it was incomprehensible. Miles away, in the neighboring suburb of Arlington Heights, the Janis family was gathering. Adam Janis, a 27-year-old postal worker, was suffering from chest pains, though he thought it was just a lingering ache. He went to the kitchen, opened a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, and took a capsule. Within minutes, he stumbled into his bedroom and collapsed. He was rushed to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. His official cause of death was listed as a massive heart attack. His family, devastated and reeling from the sudden loss, gathered at his home to make funeral arrangements. Adam's younger brother, Stanley, 25, and Stanley's wife, Teresa, 27, were overcome with grief-induced headaches. Seeking relief, they went to the same bottle of Tylenol that Adam had used just hours before. Stanley took a capsule. Then Teresa took one. What happened next transformed a family tragedy into a scene from a horror film. Stanley suddenly gasped and collapsed. Moments later, Teresa did the same. The house was filled with the frantic sounds of a 911 call, the wail of approaching sirens. Within 48 hours, 3 members of the same family were dead, all from what appeared to be sudden, catastrophic cardiac events. The cluster of deaths in one family was highly unusual, a statistical anomaly that immediately caught the attention of local authorities. 2 sharp-minded firefighters, Philip Capitelli and Richard Keyworth, were the first to connect the dots. They had responded to both the Adam Janis call and the subsequent call for Stanley and Teresa. They recalled seeing the bottle of extra-strength Tylenol on the kitchen counter during both visits. They mentioned this observation to a nurse at the hospital, Helen Jensen. Jensen, aware of the baffling death of 12-year-old Mary Kellerman just the day before, had a flash of chilling intuition. She called the medical examiner's office. Dr. Edmund Donahue, the deputy chief medical examiner, took the call. He learned that the Kellerman family had also mentioned Tylenol. A bottle had been taken from their home as a matter of routine. Dr. Donahue asked an investigator to retrieve it. This single phone call, born of a firefighter's observation and a nurse's intuition, was the key that unlocked the nightmare. The investigation now had a common denominator. The focus shifted from the victims to the one thing that connected them all: a simple, over-the-counter pain reliever. Investigators from multiple jurisdictions converged. The bottles of Tylenol from the Janus and Kellerman homes were collected and sent for urgent testing. The results came back, and they were terrifying. The red and white capsules inside the bottles were not filled with acetaminophen. They were laced with potassium cyanide. Cyanide is one of the most rapid and lethal poisons known to man. It works by blocking the body's ability to use oxygen, causing a form of cellular asphyxiation. The victim, though breathing, is effectively suffocating from the inside out. Death is swift, often occurring within minutes. The killer had loaded the capsules with a dose far exceeding the lethal minimum. There was no chance of survival. The realization sent a shockwave through law enforcement. This was not a targeted attack on a single family. The bottles had been purchased at different stores in different suburbs. This was a random act of mass poisoning. A faceless killer had weaponized one of America's most trusted products and placed it back on store shelves for anyone to purchase. The public had to be warned, and immediately. What followed was an unprecedented public health announcement. On the evening of September 30th, a citywide alert was issued. News broadcasts were interrupted. The mayor of Chicago, Jane Byrne, went on television, her face grim, and delivered a stark warning. Do not, under any circumstances, consume any Tylenol product. Police cars drove through neighborhoods, their loudspeakers blaring the same urgent message. Panic began to set in. Tylenol was a staple in nearly every American medicine cabinet. Millions of people rushed to their bathrooms, dumping bottles of the capsules into the trash, their hands shaking as they realized they had been living with a potential time bomb on their shelves. As the news spread, the body count grew. Mary Reiner, 27, a new mother in Winfield, died after taking a Tylenol for post-labor pains. Mary McFarland, 31, a mother of two from Elmhurst, collapsed and died at her office after taking a capsule for a headache. The final victim was Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant. She had purchased a bottle of Tylenol after landing at O'Hare Airport. When she failed to show up for her next flight, police entered her Chicago apartment and found her body. The open bottle of cyanide-laced Tylenol was on her bathroom counter. In the span of 3 days, 7 people were dead. The city of Chicago was in a state of siege, not from an invading army, but from an invisible poison. The investigation became one of the largest in American history. A massive, multi-agency task force was assembled. The first crucial question was, where did the poison come from? Was it an act of corporate sabotage, an inside job at a Johnson & Johnson manufacturing plant or distribution center? Investigators quickly traced the lot numbers on the contaminated bottles. They came from 2 different plants, one in Pennsylvania and one in Texas. The probability that the contamination had happened at the source, in 2 separate locations, was infinitesimally small. The poison had been introduced after the bottles had left the factory. This led to the terrifying conclusion that the killer had gone to multiple drugstores and supermarkets in the Chicago area, purchased the bottles of Tylenol, taken them to a private location, carefully opened the capsules, replaced the acetaminophen powder with cyanide, and then returned the tainted bottles to the shelves for unsuspecting customers to buy. It was an act of chilling patience and breathtaking cruelty. For Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of Tylenol's manufacturer, McNeil Consumer Products, the crisis was existential. Their flagship product, which accounted for nearly 20% of the company's profits, had become a symbol of death and terror. The company's chairman, James Burke, made a decision that would become a landmark case study in corporate ethics and crisis management. Against the advice of some who feared financial ruin, Burke chose public safety over profit. He ordered an immediate nationwide recall of all Tylenol products. Over 31 million bottles with a retail value of more than $100 million were pulled from the shelves. The company also offered to replace any Tylenol product the public had already purchased, free of charge. It was a massive financial blow, but it was an act that likely saved countless lives and, in the long run, saved the company's reputation. With the immediate danger contained, the hunt for the killer, dubbed the Tylenol terrorist by the media, intensified. The investigation was a frantic search for a needle in a haystack. There was no forensic evidence, no fingerprints on the bottles that could be traced to a suspect. The killer was a ghost. Then, a break. A week after the murders, Johnson & Johnson received an extortion letter. The author demanded $1 million to stop the killing. The letter was a jumble of accusations and threats. The investigation now had a potential suspect. The letter was traced back to a man named James Lewis, a disgruntled former tax accountant who had a history of lashing out at previous employers. He and his wife, Leanne, had moved to Chicago and then fled to New York City shortly after the murders. A nationwide manhunt was launched for the Lewises. They were eventually located in New York after a librarian recognized them from a wanted poster. James Lewis was arrested and charged, but not with murder. He was charged with extortion. Lewis readily admitted to writing the letter. He claimed his motive was to embarrass his wife's former employer, to whom he had also sent a threatening letter, but he vehemently denied any involvement in the poisonings themselves. He claimed he was simply an opportunist, seeing the Tylenol crisis as a way to settle an old score. Investigators dug deep into Lewis's background. They found he was intelligent, arrogant, and capable of elaborate schemes. He had a degree in pharmacology. He had access to chemistry libraries. He fit the profile of a potential poisoner. But the evidence simply wasn't there. There was nothing to forensically link him to the cyanide or the Tylenol bottles. The case against him for the murders was entirely circumstantial. While prosecutors were convinced he was their man, they knew they could not prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. James Lewis was convicted of extortion and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was never charged with the Tylenol murders. Other suspects were investigated. A man named Roger Arnold was questioned after coworkers reported he had spoken of possessing cyanide, but no solid evidence ever emerged. The investigation stalled. The leads grew cold. The phantom remained at large. The Chicago Tylenol murders case is officially unsolved. The person or persons responsible for the deaths of 7 innocent people have never been brought to justice. The crime remains a dark, open wound in American history. But the legacy of the Tylenol murders is not just one of unsolved crime and enduring grief. It is a story of profound and permanent change. In the wake of the terror, the entire world of consumer packaging was transformed. Johnson & Johnson, determined to regain public trust, led the way. They reintroduced Tylenol, but this time in a solid caplet form, which was more difficult to tamper with. More importantly, they introduced new, triple-sealed, tamper-resistant packaging. There was a foil seal glued over the mouth of the bottle, a plastic ring around the neck, and a sealed box. This layered defense system, now a standard on nearly every food and drug product we buy, was born directly from the tragedy of 1982. The federal government passed new laws making product tampering a federal crime. The Tylenol murders represent a unique and terrifying form of evil. It was a faceless, random act of terror that exploited the most basic trust between a consumer and a product. The killer did not just poison 7 people. They poisoned the well of public confidence. Every time we open a bottle of medicine and have to break a foil seal or twist off a plastic ring, we are interacting with the ghost of this crime. The victims Mary Kellerman, Adam, Stanley, and Teresa Janis, Mary Reiner, Mary McFarland, and Paula Prince were lost to a senseless act of anonymous malice. But their legacy is a world made demonstrably safer, a world forced to confront its own vulnerability, all because a phantom decided to turn a trusted remedy into a weapon. Case 3. The Georgy Markov umbrella assassination. The poisonings we have discussed so far were motivated by personal psychopathy or anonymous terror. They were crimes committed by individuals operating outside the structures of power. But our next case takes us into the clandestine world of international espionage, where poison is not a tool of a lone madman, but a state-sanctioned instrument of political assassination. This is the story of a murder so audacious, so cinematic in its execution, that it seems ripped from the pages of a Cold War spy novel. It is the story of Georgy Markov and the weapon that killed him, a simple, ordinary umbrella. Georgy Markov was a man who lived 2 lives. In his first life, he was a celebrated Bulgarian novelist and playwright. He was a member of the country's cultural elite, a favorite of the ruling communist regime led by the hardline dictator Todor Zhivkov. But Markov was also an intellectual and a dissident at heart. He grew increasingly disillusioned with the oppressive, suffocating nature of the Zhivkov government. He saw the hypocrisy, the corruption, and the lack of creative freedom. In 1969, while traveling in Italy, Markov made a life-altering decision. He defected to the West. He eventually settled in London, where he began his second life. He became a journalist for the BBC World Service and Radio Free Europe, 2 of the most potent voices broadcasting Western news and commentary behind the Iron Curtain. From his platform in London, Markov became one of the most prominent and powerful critics of the Bulgarian regime. His weekly radio broadcasts, titled In Absentia Reports about Bulgaria, were a sensation. He used his sharp wit and insider's knowledge to expose the corruption and absurdity of Zhivkov's government. He mocked the dictator, he revealed embarrassing secrets of the ruling class, and he gave a voice to the silent, oppressed Bulgarian people. To the Zhivkov regime, Georgy Markov was not just a critic. He was a traitor, a dangerous enemy of the state whose voice had to be silenced. The Bulgarian secret police, the Darzhavna Sigurnost or DS, had a long and bloody history of dealing with dissidents abroad. They were known for their ruthlessness. An order was given from the highest levels of the Bulgarian government. Georgy Markov was to be eliminated. But this was London in the 1970s, not Sofia. The assassination had to be subtle, deniable. It required a weapon that was both lethal and untraceable. For this, the DS turned to their powerful patrons in Moscow, the KGB. The KGB's infamous poison laboratory, known as the Chamber, was tasked with developing the perfect weapon. What they created was a masterpiece of clandestine technology. The murder weapon would be an ordinary-looking umbrella, modified to fire a tiny, pinhead-sized pellet. The pellet itself was a marvel of malign ingenuity. It was crafted from a platinum-iridium alloy and had 2 minuscule holes drilled into it, creating a hollow reservoir. This tiny cavity was designed to hold a minute but lethal dose of one of the world's most potent toxins, ricin. Ricin is a naturally occurring poison derived from castor beans. It is incredibly lethal. A dose the size of a few grains of salt can kill an adult. It works by inhibiting protein synthesis, leading to widespread cell death and organ failure. Its symptoms are also deceptively slow to appear and mimic those of severe food poisoning or sepsis, making it an ideal poison for a deniable assassination. The pellet was coated with a special wax designed to melt at body temperature. Once fired into the target, the wax would melt, releasing the ricin into the bloodstream. The pellet was so small that the entry wound would be almost invisible. The plan was set. An assassin was dispatched to London. He was code-named Piccadilly. On September 7, 1978, Georgy Markov was walking across London's Waterloo Bridge on his way to work at the BBC. It was a normal afternoon, the bridge crowded with commuters. As he waited at a bus stop, he felt a sudden, sharp sting in the back of his right thigh. He turned and saw a man behind him stooping to pick up an umbrella that he had apparently dropped. The man muttered, "I'm sorry," in a foreign accent, hailed a taxi, and quickly disappeared into the London traffic. Markov felt a dull ache in his leg, but he thought little of it. It was a clumsy, everyday encounter. He continued on to his office at the BBC. A few hours later, however, he developed a high fever. That evening, he was racked with intense bouts of nausea and vomiting. His condition deteriorated rapidly. He was admitted to St. James Hospital in London, his body in septic shock. From his hospital bed, Markov, his mind still sharp despite his failing body, began to piece together what had happened. He recalled the incident on the bridge, the sting in his leg. He told his wife, Annabelle, and the doctors that he believed he had been poisoned by the Bulgarian secret police. He was certain the umbrella was the delivery device. At first, the doctors were skeptical. The story seemed too outlandish, like something out of a James Bond film. But Markov was insistent. His symptoms were baffling, his decline catastrophic. No antibiotics seemed to work. His organs began to fail one by one. Scotland Yard was called in to investigate. They examined Markov's thigh and found a tiny, almost invisible puncture mark. The doctors, now taking his story seriously, were fighting a battle against an unknown enemy. They didn't know they were dealing with ricin, for which there is no antidote. 4 days after the encounter on Waterloo Bridge, on September 11, 1978, Georgy Markov died. He was 49 years old. His death was now an official murder investigation. The British government ordered an autopsy. Pathologists carefully excised the small area of tissue from his thigh where he had felt the sting. Under a microscope, they found it, a tiny metallic sphere no bigger than the head of a pin, the infamous ricin-laced pellet. The discovery was a bombshell. It confirmed Markov's dying words and revealed the horrifying sophistication of the plot. The umbrella murder, as it was dubbed by the press, became one of the most notorious assassinations of the Cold War. It was a chilling message from the Eastern Bloc to all dissidents. You are never safe. We can reach you anywhere, at any time, with a weapon you will never see coming. The investigation was massive, but it hit a wall of silence. The assassin, Piccadilly, had vanished without a trace. The British government knew that the order had come from Sofia, likely with the assistance of Moscow, but in the political climate of the Cold War, there was little they could do. Proving state sponsorship in a court of law was nearly impossible. The Bulgarian government flatly denied any involvement, dismissing the accusations as anti-communist propaganda. For over a decade, the case remained frozen in the icy standoff of the Cold War. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The communist regimes of Eastern Europe began to crumble one after another. In Bulgaria, Todor Zhivkov's long and brutal dictatorship came to an end. With the fall of communism, there was a glimmer of hope that the truth behind Markov's murder would finally be revealed. The new democratic government in Bulgaria opened its own investigation. Investigators began to sift through the vast, secret archives of the DS. What they found was a trail of evidence that confirmed the plot. They found documents ordering the neutralization of Markov. They found travel records for a Danish national of Italian origin named Francesco Gallino, a shadowy operative who had worked for the DS. He was believed to be the prime suspect, the man codenamed Piccadilly. Gallino was tracked down and arrested in Denmark in 1993. He was interrogated for hours by Danish and British investigators. He admitted to having worked for the Bulgarian secret police, but he denied any role in the Markov assassination. The evidence against him was strong but circumstantial. Crucially, the alleged murder weapon, the umbrella, was never found. After 2 days of questioning, with insufficient evidence to charge him with murder, Francesco Gallino was released. He disappeared, and his current whereabouts are unknown. The Bulgarian investigation also stalled. Key files from the DS archives related to the murder had been mysteriously destroyed. Key witnesses died under suspicious circumstances. It became clear that powerful figures from the old regime were still working to ensure the full story never came out. The case was officially closed in Bulgaria in 2013 when the statute of limitations expired. To this day, no one has ever been brought to justice for the murder of Georgy Markov. His assassination remains a masterpiece of a state-sponsored Kalinga crime that was both brazen in its execution and perfectly deniable. It demonstrated the terrifying reach of a totalitarian state and its willingness to use the most sophisticated tools of science for the most brutal ends. The umbrella, a benign object of everyday life, a symbol of shelter from the rain, was transformed into a weapon of silent, untraceable death. Georgy Markov was killed not by a bullet or a bomb, but by a whisper of poison delivered on a crowded bridge in broad daylight. A final, fatal punctuation mark in a life dedicated to speaking truth to power. Case 4. The Stella Nickel Case. The cases we have examined so far involve a range of motives: intellectual curiosity, anonymous terror, and political assassination. Our final story, however, brings us to the most ancient and intimate of motives: greed. It is a case that began as a tragic echo of the Tylenol murders, but was soon revealed to be a far more personal and cynical plot. It is the story of a woman who saw a national tragedy not as a warning, but as an opportunity and a blueprint for murder. This is the case of Stella Nickel. In June 1986, in the town of Auburn, Washington, a 52-year-old man named Bruce Nickel came home from his job as a heavy equipment operator. He had a headache. He went to his kitchen, opened a bottle of extra-strength Excedrin, and took 4 capsules. A short time later, his wife, Stella, found him collapsed on the floor of their mobile home, gasping for breath. He was rushed to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The initial diagnosis was emphysema, a chronic lung condition from which he suffered. His death, while sudden, seemed to have a plausible medical explanation. A week later, just a few miles away, a 40-year-old bank manager named Sue Snow woke up in the middle of the night with a migraine. Her 15-year-old daughter found her on the bathroom floor the next morning, unconscious. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, but she died later that day without regaining consciousness. Her daughter, distraught, mentioned that her mother had taken 2 Excedrin capsules for her headache. At the hospital, the mention of the painkiller, combined with the sudden, inexplicable nature of Sue Snow's death, triggered an alarm. The memory of the Chicago Tylenol murders, which had occurred just 4 years earlier, was still fresh in the public and medical consciousness. The King County Medical Examiner, Dr. Donald Ray, ordered immediate toxicology tests on both Sue Snow and Bruce Nickel. The results confirmed their worst fears. The bodies of both victims were filled with lethal amounts of cyanide. The police immediately issued a public warning, urging residents to avoid all Excedrin products. Bristol Myers, the manufacturer of Excedrin, ordered a nationwide recall of the specific lots in question. The FBI was called in. It seemed the Tylenol terrorist or a copycat had struck again. Panic began to ripple through the Seattle area. Investigators descended on the case. They collected the Excedrin bottles from both the Nickel and Snow homes. Inside, they found capsules that had been tampered with. The original powdered medicine had been replaced with a crystalline substance that was quickly identified as potassium cyanide. The hunt was on for a random killer, a phantom who was lacing store shelves with poison. But as the investigation deepened, a number of details began to seem out of place. This case was different from the Chicago murders. In Chicago, 7 people had died from 5 different contaminated bottles, purchased from multiple stores. Here, there were only 2 deaths linked to 2 bottles. Investigators, with the help of the FDA, began a massive effort to test tens of thousands of Excedrin capsules from the recalled lots. They found only 5 contaminated capsules in total, all of them contained within the 2 bottles from the victims' homes. There were no other poison bottles found on any store shelves in the entire state of Washington. This was a critical discovery. It suggested that this was not a random act of mass terror aimed at the general public. This was a targeted attack. The poisoner had not placed multiple tainted bottles in stores. They had somehow ensured that these 2 specific bottles ended up in the hands of the victims. But how? Sue Snow and Bruce Nickel had no connection to each other. They had bought their Excedrin at different stores weeks apart. The theory of a targeted attack didn't seem to make sense. The investigation stalled. Then the focus shifted to the victims' families. And in particular, it settled on Bruce Nickel's grieving widow, Stella. Stella Nickel, 44 at the time, presented herself as a devastated wife. She spoke to the media, her voice filled with emotion, warning others about the dangers of product tampering. She seemed to be a victim, caught in the terrifying crossfire of a random killer. But investigators began to notice inconsistencies in her story and her behavior. The first red flag was the insurance money. Stella had recently taken out multiple life insurance policies on her husband, Bruce. One policy for accidental death had been taken out just a year earlier. In total, if Bruce's death was ruled an accident, which a death by product tampering would be, Stella stood to collect over $176,000. If his death was from natural causes like emphysema, she would receive significantly less. She had a clear and substantial financial motive for her husband's death to be ruled an accident. Investigators also discovered that Stella had been complaining to friends about her husband. She called him boring. She expressed a desire for a different, more exciting life, one that would be possible with a large cash payout. The most damning evidence, however, came from Stella's own daughter from a previous marriage, Cynthia Hamilton. In the months following the murders, Cynthia approached the police with a story that broke the case wide open. She told them that her mother had been researching poisons for months before Bruce's death. She had checked out books from the library about poisons, including one that specifically detailed the effects of cyanide. Cynthia claimed her mother had spoken openly about wanting to kill Bruce for the insurance money. She even said that Stella had tried to poison him before, using foxglove from her garden, but it had only made him sick. Cynthia's testimony provided the motive and the method. The final piece of the puzzle was connecting Stella to the cyanide itself. Investigators discovered that Stella had purchased an unusual amount of algae destroyer for her fish tank. They sent a sample of the product for testing. Contained cyanide. The pieces were all falling into place. But one crucial question remained. If Stella had murdered her husband, how and why had Sue Snow died? The two were strangers. The answer, prosecutors would argue, was a stroke of diabolical genius. Stella had learned a lesson from the Tylenol case. She knew that a single, isolated poisoning would immediately point suspicion towards her. She needed to create the illusion of a random, anonymous killer. She needed to create a copycat crime. The prosecution's theory was this. Stella Nickell, armed with her library research and the cyanide from the algae destroyer, had carefully laced several Excedrin capsules with poison. She gave some to her husband, killing him. Then, to create her cover story, she took the other contaminated bottles and secretly placed them on the shelves of local stores, knowing that eventually, someone else would buy one. Sue Snow was not a target. She was a sacrifice. She was Stella's alibi, an innocent victim whose death was necessary to obscure the real crime. The murder of Bruce Nickell for insurance money. The evidence against Stella mounted. Investigators found her fingerprints on the library books about poison. The librarian recalled her asking specific questions about the lethal properties of certain substances. Store records showed that she had purchased the algae destroyer. In December 1987, Stella Nickell was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder by product tampering. She was the first person in history to be charged under the new federal product tampering laws that had been enacted after the Chicago Tylenol case. Her trial in the spring of 1988 was a media sensation. The prosecution, led by the U.S. Attorney's Office, laid out their case meticulously. They presented the financial motive, the testimony of her daughter, the library records, and the purchase of the algae destroyer. They argued that Stella Nickell was a cold, calculating killer who had cleverly used the template of a national tragedy to commit a personal, greedy murder. The defense argued that Stella was a loving wife who was being framed by a vengeful daughter. They attacked Cynthia Hamilton's credibility, painting her as a troubled young woman who was lying to get a reward. They argued that the case was entirely circumstantial and that the real random killer was still at large. The key moment in the trial came with the forensic evidence related to the algae destroyer. An FBI expert testified that the cyanide crystals found in the Excedrin capsules were visually and chemically identical to the crystals found in the algae killer product Stella had purchased. The link was made. After a month-long trial, the jury found Stella Nickell guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive 90-year prison terms. She would die in prison. The Stella Nickell case is a chilling study in calculated cruelty. She did not just murder her husband. She weaponized public fear. She took the genuine terror of the Tylenol murders and twisted it into a tool for personal gain. Her crime had a unique twofold malice. First, she murdered her husband, a man who trusted her, for a sum of money. Second, she murdered a complete stranger, Sue Snow, a woman whose only mistake was having a headache on the wrong night. This second death was not an act of passion or anger. It was a cold, strategic move, a human sacrifice offered up to create a smokescreen. In the gallery of poisoners, Stella Nickell stands out not for her scientific sophistication, but for her cynical and profane understanding of human psychology, and for her willingness to turn a national nightmare into her own murderous playbook. From the boy scientist who turned his family into an experiment, to the faceless phantom who terrorized a nation. From the Cold War assassin with his umbrella of death, to the greedy wife who mimicked a tragedy for profit. The methods of the poisoner are as varied as their motives, but they all share a common thread: a chilling detachment, a willingness to stand back and watch as their handiwork takes its slow, inexorable toll. These stories are a reminder that the greatest dangers often come not with a bang, but with a quiet, insidious whisper, hidden in the things we trust the most. For now, from all of us at the Crime Folio, we wish you a safe and peaceful night. Sleep well.